Perhaps you can switch off and on again, Brigitte, or else you can. Oh, you must. Oh, I know what's happening. You're seeing a close-up of the avocado. I've zoomed in quite a lot. No, I think there's.
Okay, it's working now. I did it again. Thanks.
Super. Okay. Now this is the last slide that we actually spoke about, and again, there's the illusion of depth happening. And the funny thing is that the moment that we switch the image, right? So top becomes bottom and bottom becomes top. Basically, we see that concave becomes convex and vice versa. This is just a matter of an illusion. Literally, the eye is being made to believe something which is not a reality, and that is the beauty of for example, shading with pencils or painting, that you are creating elements which are technically painted on a flat surface, or drawn on a flat surface, but the eye is really quite a gullible organ in a way. Is the eye an organ? Can the eye be called an organ? I don't know. Okay, let's call the eye an organ. We can do a quick Google search. Is the eye an organ? Would anyone be able to answer that? Is the eye an organ? Let me see. Is the eye an organ? Is the eye considered an organ? The human eye is an organ that detects light, and yes, it is. It is. In fact, it is. Thank you. The eye is an organ. I was never meant to study biology, although I did try to study biology at O level, and my father did want me to become a doctor at one point in time, something that I never ended up doing, as you might have guessed. And that would have been to the detriment of humanity if I managed to become a doctor, because I would have been a very terrible doctor indeed. Because I wouldn't even have known that the eye is an organ. Moving on. So the eye is an organ, and it's a very gullible organ in the sense that it's cheated in quite a part. You can cheat it in a very particular way. You know, the thing is, our brain. The funny thing is that our brain knows that it's being cheated, yet the eye doesn't realize that, being an organ, just something there, wobbly. But it's a painting, it's a flat surface, yet your eye is telling you that there's depth, that there's aerial depth, there's aerial perspective, there's linear perspective, there's so many elements that are happening to create this sense of realism, right? And because of this, we can actually have something like the games that we have today, which are so realistic, hyper-realistic in some sense. And as games progress, the hyperrealism is becoming even more and more increased. And to tell you the truth, this is one of the reasons why we have such an immersive element in games today, and why virtual reality, for example, another thing is that virtual reality can link so effectively with the graphics that we have today to be able to create a world where you can dive in and literally submerge yourself for some time due to its very deep immersive qualities. Here we have another image, a similar image in reality. So if you were to look at the circles, you would realize that over here we have a circle which seems like it's bouncing up, sort of it's coming out of the picture again. Here it's like it's concave, if I'm not mistaken. It's depressed. And if you were to switch the image around, notice that even the words in this case have been switched. Everything just appears the opposite automatically. We have the same situation as the avocado over here. And again, we know that that is not reality because we have just seen it happening, but our eye continues to see that what is being presented to it. So this is the extremity that the eye can be cheated into believing what it says. I have a picture here, a print by William Hogarth, 1754, so we're talking 18th century. Can you guys have a look at the picture and tell me what's weird in that image? First of all, at first glance, I am sure, 100% definite, that most of you, if not all of you, will not see anything strange. But then if you start looking quite deeply at that image, you start realizing that some things are, one can say, a bit amiss. There's some things which are weird. Can you pinpoint a couple of things, perhaps? Can you tell me what you think doesn't really fit?
The wooden beam.
Sorry.
The wooden beam. What about the wooden beam, Brigitte?
It's in the foreground and at the background at the same time.
Here we go. So it's stuck over here, and then it's stuck to this, which is actually behind this building, and it can't be because we see that here it's level, right? But at first glance, did you really notice that mistake? Did it really, really come up into your face and you were like, it was garishly in your face, and you were like, no, that sounds so wrong, that looks so wrong.
No.
Yeah, I doubt you did so, right? What else? Thank you, Brigitte.
The sign where you're pointing right now is like behind the trees.
The sign is behind the trees. Brilliant. The sign is behind the trees. So here we have a hanging sign. Must be the name of the tavern, perhaps. And there's actually behind the trees, which are here very much in the background. So here we have quite a few layers. We have the foreground. We have a middle ground over here. We have quite a few middle grounds. So this is a middle ground. This is a middle ground. This is a middle ground. And then we have the background over here, which is the sky. So literally it is in the furthest middle ground, they have the trees, and they are actually in front of the sign, which doesn't make sense. Again, did you notice that once you had a quick look at the drawing, or did you have to look into the drawing to be able to understand that situation?
Once you pointed out there's something amiss, I started looking for it.
You started looking and you started realizing. Okay, we have more. Brilliant, thank you. We have more. Mm. Yeah. Yep. Very, very noticeable. Yes, it's this guy over here at the top of the hill, which is literally, at the very end of our painting. So it's the deepest part, but the sky, and it's actually as big as these sheep over here, and nearly as big as this guy over here, which doesn't make sense, obviously. And this guy is the same level as the church, which again doesn't make sense. And again, if you look carefully, this guy is actually lighting his cigar or a pipe from the candle that this woman is putting out of the window. Did you notice that? There's a sort of an action and a reaction over here going on. Some type of communication, which doesn't make sense. Obviously, this would look like. Have you ever been to Pisa, for example, and you did the déjà vu photo? You took the déjà vu photo where you try to look like you're holding up the Tower of Pisa or something similar, or you're like holding the moon in your hand. I'm sure you did it sometime in your life. Yeah, the little boy or the little girl has to come out in those occasions, and you have to recreate that image. And this is basically the same thing because we have two very different levels. There's the foreground, there's the background over there. And the way they've been placed next to each other, it seems that there is some type of interaction. There's more.
The fishermen and how their lines intersect.
It's either this guy has a really long fishing rod, which is totally unbelievable. To have that kind of fishing rod, it must be about 10 to 15 meters long, which is totally impossible. And the fact it goes beyond the fishing rod of the other guy over here, so that is definitely not the case. So again, that's an illusion. It's an illusion. Great. Anything else? The bird above it, it's either a very small tree or a very huge bird. Must be some massive bird to be able to be like that big. Indeed, that's great. There's a couple more which are quite obvious, yet you have still not noticed, and they are obvious because they are very much related to perspective, and it is the building over here.
The boat underneath the bridge. It's like the boat is like beyond the bridge, but like his cloud of him shooting something. The like recoil cloud is like in front of the bridge.
Yes.
So it's like it doesn't make any sense.
Exactly. The boat is, if you were to align the boat with the bridge, the depth of the bridge over here, you would see that the boat is further away than the powder that's coming out here, the whiplash or whatever it's called of the gun smoke. So yes, that's also another point.
The tile that the man at the front is standing on looks a bit weird. It's like he's standing outside of the building on nothing or something.
You've noticed one of the most unnoticeable elements. Who was this again, please?
Bridget.
Bridget, what you've noticed here is a very interesting case of extremely wrong perspective. Because technically speaking, if you're looking inside an image, then the perspective needs to be totally opposite. It needs to be wider over here and going in, going into a vanishing point, all right, rather than going out. That does not make sense. In fact, if you look at this building over here, you see a good type of perspective, okay, because it's actually receding. Notice that the building is receding, it's getting smaller as it goes into the distance. That's linear perspective. So this should also be receding as it goes inside rather than outside the painting. So that's a very good point. And it's usually one of the elements which is recognized last, because it is very much tied to linear perspective, which is a bit more difficult to gauge, although it is very much obvious as being weird. The eye will immediately realize that it's weird, that something is very much wrong, but then it wouldn't be able to say exactly what is wrong. So you managed to grasp that. Now, if you look at the perspective over here, you can see that this building is receding, which is brilliant. That's how perspective happens. But then the building over here, it is not receding, but is actually, growing into the distance, which is totally impossible. It should also be receding. Did you notice what I'm saying? So this line, are you seeing my cursor, please?
Yes.
Yes. So this line should be like this, should be leaning down rather than leaning up. Yeah, leaning down rather than leaning up. Let me show you something. Let me show something so that this will make a bit more sense. So let's go into perspective, 1 point perspective, and we'll go into this over here, and here it goes. So this is perspective. All the lines is 1 point perspective. All the lines recede into the distance, into what we call the vanishing point. Okay? All the lines are receding into the vanishing point. Did you notice that? Let's find another picture. All right, all the lines are receding. This is technically an exercise that I usually get my students to do. Let's go into this, and you'll have a better understanding. Here we go. Can you see the lines receding into the distance? This is 1 point perspective. All right. There's what we call a horizon line. The horizon line is the level of eyesight. Okay, so that is where we're looking. That is our level. Has nothing to do with the actual horizon in the image. Nothing to do with that. It's called horizon line because it is the eye level of the viewer. And this is the vanishing point, the VP, the vanishing point. In 1 point perspective, there is one vanishing point. In 2 point perspective, there are two vanishing points. And the 3 point perspective, obviously, there are 3 vanishing points. But those are a bit too into the distance. Let's just concentrate to 1 point over here. So notice that all the lines recede into the distance. And it's called the vanishing point because that is where the eye can't see anymore. Right now, the vanishing point is actually behind this character who is playing a guitar on a bridge. That's how it looks. Here I have a painting by Van Gogh. It is the painting of a room entitled My Room, surprisingly, or not so. Again, look at the eye level. This is eye level. Notice the difference in eye level here, how high it is from the bottom of the image. And notice the eye level over here, right? How lower down it is. So the eye level is called the horizon line. In both cases, that's horizon line also. And here we see that all the lines actually of the chair, of the bed, the paintings, everything still recede in distance. Although this is what we call an impressionist painting. So impressionists give an impression of reality. So they use color. In fact, the Fauves were amazing impressionists because they use very, very weird colors. Anything but realistic, but they still managed to maintain an element of realism, which was sort of their strongest point. But this is not Fauves, this is purely impressionist. And in this painting, we see that although it is impressionism, yet Van Gogh still keeps very strong to the rules of perspective. He does this because if he lost perspective, then he would have lost too many elements of reality, and that would have ended in a painting which would have become too unrealistic. Okay. This is a very simplistic drawing of a street. Okay. Very simplistic drawing of a street over here, where we see that the vanishing point is over here. we see that all the lines, in fact, if we were to draw it, okay, this is something that I would love to do at some point if we have time, obviously, we'd see that all the lines of the windows, for example, the doors and the shop signs, the pavements, the signs on the road, they all converge, all converge into the vanishing point, and that is how depth is created. Just by literally drawing a series of lines, we have created this illusion of depth, which in reality is still a flat surface. Same thing over here, a bit more complex. Same thing over here, 1 point again. Same thing over here, right? We have 1 point perspective there, and sort of obviously the amount of detail is insane in this drawing. Even the way the lampposts are drawn, and this gives an extreme idea of realism, because obviously you will immediately be able to not see mistakes. So in not seeing mistakes, you will believe. That is the way perspective works. Yeah. Here we go. Couple of photons. Again, with the rule of 1 point perspective. 1 point perspective, you literally just using 3, so we don't have lines over here. Okay, we do have lines, but they're not straight lines, but you can still see the idea, have the idea of this. There's a vanishing point, there's the horizon over here. Horizon line would be roughly on the same line, then the vanishing point would be somewhere over there. Again, 2 human beings in a car, but we can definitely immediately see the vanishing point being somewhere over here. Okay, and everything else just follows the rule of perspective. Okay. Okay, that's... this is something that's used a lot by interior design, for example, to create a bit of a realist approach. There we go. There we go. Okay. There's tons of pictures, obviously, and the more careful you are to be able to draw perspective realistically, the more realistic the painting actually becomes. I love this one because sort of, although the subjects are the human beings, technically speaking, there is a very high concept of depth simply by following the rule of perspective here in just these couple of lines, literally 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5. And automatically they are in a space, in a real space. It's a tangible space. It's a tangible space. Okay, let me show you one other element before we move on to something else. Just give me a minute, please. Are you all with me, guys? Are we all understanding? Any questions? Any comments that you'd like to pass?
All good.
Very good.
Yes, all good here.
Very good. Off. Trying to draw a particular, find a particular painting. Again, being very bad at names. I don't know why. I forgot. Okay, let me just show you this first. Let's look at this image over here. This is an image from God of War. Some of you might have recognized it. I think it's the first installment. I recognize the axe from the first installment. Do you think it has perspective? Yes, brilliant, very good. You can actually see how the artist, the concept artist, managed to use this figure itself to actually point us into the image. Okay, so this is very much extremely linear. Okay, you can see a line literally flowing from there to there. Okay, so the vanishing point would be somewhere over here. Even these follow the rule of the vanishing point. I think this is the second installment because there's his son. Now I'm realizing this is the second God of War. So here you can see sort of that the size of this figure is much bigger than the size of this figure, which is much bigger than the size of this figure. And if you were to look carefully, sort of that is because sort of they are all following the rule of the linear perspective. You can see a line over here, a line over there, you can see a line over there, okay, a line over here, line over there, line over here, line over there. They're all following the rule of perspective with the vanishing point over there, which gives it a lot of depth. And there is another perspective which exists in this image. Any idea what that is?
It's mistier the further back you go.
Mm-hmm. And any idea what we can call that?
No.
Okay, that is
Field of
aerial.
view.
It's aerial perspective. It's aerial perspective. That is what we call aerial. So there's linear perspective, okay, and there's aerial perspective. Okay, and aerial perspective basically means that the closer anything is, the more defined and colorful is going to be, rather than colorful, full of color. It's a big difference between colorful and full of color. Full of color means that color is more obvious, while colorful means that there's a lot of color. So in this case, the color is not that obvious, but we see that there are elements of color in the foreground. Those elements of color is totally lost the further away we go. There's very little color obvious over here. We see just that tinge, a brownish tinge over here of sepias and umbers, and then over here there's absolutely no color. It's just gray. And then again, we also see a sort of ethereal element which is hiding most of the background, putting it even further away from us and creating that illusory depth. Okay, so those are two kinds of perspective that exist, and if used in a good combination, they can create a very effective illusion of depth. Now I'm looking for the Battle of San Romano. Now this painting I'm going to show you, it's a very, very, very old painting. Very old painting. Let me see which is the best one. So this would be, yeah. Okay. Can you see this painting over here? Let me try to find a bigger version. There we go. This is the Battle of San Romano. But I think there's a better version of it because we can't really see that much of the ground. Give me a sec. Okay, I think this is much better. Yes, that's much better. There we go. Okay, let's ignore these points over here. This was one of the paintings, one of the first painting, if not the first painting, where perspective was rediscovered. Linear perspective was rediscovered. First of all, we should notice, we need to notice that there is very little aerial perspective, in that the artists of the time, so this is basically the 1400s, moving on to the 1500s, the artists of the time had totally lost the concept of perspective, so there was absolutely no realism in painting. It was a concept which was absolutely lost. They had no idea how to replicate it, and so they had no idea how to create realist images. That had been lost with the Romans and the Greeks. Specifically the Romans and post-Romans in what we call the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, and that is why they were known as the Dark Ages, because obviously there was no enlightenment, there was no art, there was very little music, and so on and so forth. Some time was needed for people to start interesting themselves a bit more. Wars became a bit less frequent, people had more money to spend on art, and they started trying to rediscover these lost treasures and these lost abilities. And we have this beautiful installment of the Battle of San Romano. It's actually on 3 paintings. It's the beginning of the battle, the middle of the battle, and the end of the battle. There's 3 of them. They are in 3 different museums around the world. One of them in Britain, the other in the US, and one of them, if I'm not mistaken, in Germany. 100% sure, but I know they are in 3 different places. And this is the most famous one because it's the middle painting, which is the crux of the battle, the middle, the heat of the battle, and this is in London. Now, it is extremely famous because it has a very strong idea of perspective. All right, so we see that sort of there is a receding of the horses and the soldiers into the distance. They become smaller as we go. But that is not as strong as the fact that the artist Paolo Cello was a mathematician. Paolo Cello was primarily a mathematician and not an artist, and he knew that to be able to demonstrate his ability of rediscovering linear perspective, and in this case 1-point perspective, by painting it, because it was the most visual way of delivering it to the people that he wanted to show his ability, right? So that is what he did. So he drew a grid. He literally drew a grid, and for 1-point perspective, with the vanishing point being somewhere over here, and on the head of this individual, who's the prince, Niccolo da Tolentino, is a style of Florentine art called Mazzocchi, the international blah blah blah. So this is the prince or whoever. There's a whole story behind it, which we're not interested in. Now, after the artist finished the painting, being a mathematician, was extremely proud of his work, and he wanted to actually demonstrate that, he was really good at perspective, and he actually has discovered something which is amazing. So what he did, that he did not want to lose the grid that he created, so he drew the weapons on the floor, the discarded weapons, in a way which literally replicated the 1-point perspective. Can you see that all the weapons discarded on the floor are leading up to the vanishing point? Can you see it happening, guys? Can you see it happening? The weapons leading up to the vanishing point?
Yes.
Yes, brilliant. The thing is, it's actually, it makes it hilarious in a way, because weapons don't fall like that, according to perspective. And even the soldier over here, this is the first time in history, after so many hundreds of years, that someone attempted foreshortening. Now, foreshortening is a very important concept in art. Foreshortening is when something appears bigger when you are looking at it than the closer it is, the closer part of the thing is bigger than the further part of the thing. And it's not just bigger, but it's also distorted. So if I were to look up foreshortening of arm, you would see something like this. And this would be foreshortening. Can you see the arm over here? It looks great, but it looks great because it is drawn in a twisted way, right? But to the eye, it appears perfect then. This would be another concept, okay? So this is totally elongated, and this is foreshortening, and this is absolutely foreshortened. Notice that the fist is much bigger than the shoulder, right? Because obviously it's closer to us. And over here, it has shortened. This has become much shorter over here. That's why it's foreshortening, because you are shortening the object, okay, to ensure that it has more visibility in the foreground. That's why foreshortening. And this is what he tried to do over here. He tried to foreshorten a dead soldier on the ground, but he did one massive mistake. Can you tell me what the mistake is? Can you recognize the mistake about this foreshortened soldier? What?
Maybe the feet. I
What
don't
about them?
The head seems it should be under the horse, not all in front of it.
It's not about that. It is, but thank you for trying, both of you. I really appreciate it. No, the thing is that the foreshortening he did was actually the opposite of what he should have done. These legs should have appeared smaller than this part. So technically speaking, this should have been twisted the other way around, or the body should have been smaller than the legs. Are you understand? Because the closer it is to the viewer, the bigger it is, right? But if you look at the legs, actually they're smaller than the rest of the body, which shouldn't be like that. So if we were to look at this particular painting, very famous image, again, of foreshortening, again, there is the same mistake. Do you notice the mistake? The head over here is huge when compared to the feet. They didn't realize that. When you look at it, there's something wrong. Did you realize that there's something wrong? Something weird. He looks like, that guy from Game of Thrones.
Yes.
Peter Dinklage.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I mean nothing wrong to Peter Dinklage. I mean nothing wrong to.
No, I know what you mean. Yeah, the chest looks a bit too big as well.
He looks dwarfish. He looks dwarfish. Why does he look dwarfish? Because the head actually should be much, much, much smaller than it is, compared especially to the feet. So the feet should be actually bigger than they are. And actually, it shouldn't grow as it's receding in the distance, but it should actually diminish. So what we should see over here, that the shoulders are smaller than the distance here between the legs. And the head should be much smaller to be able to convey an idea of actual form. So they were still trying to discover something. They were still trying to discover something which they couldn't really manage appropriately. This is a whole paper on what I'm saying, all right, guys? So there were whole studies about, poor people. They tried to rediscover something so important, but it took them so long to actually manage to do it. And now we have all these possibilities, all these games, virtual reality, we can do anything in such a realistic way, thanks to these people who battled their own demons to be able to discover, rediscover what has been lost over time. And look at this now. What do you think of that? Does it look realistic?
Yes, looks much better.
Exactly. This is a perfect rendition of foreshadow, or foreshortening. Perfect rendition. Because the feet are obviously very close to our face, so they're humongous. You see the fact that the thighs over here and the knees are have been twisted in a way which looks actually quite good, even the body and then you see the hands over here coming out and a very small chin over there because it is the furthest away from us. Okay, so that's that. Now let's move on because we've gone quite a bit deep into that subject. So another image that I would like to show you is this image, and I would like you to have a look at this image and tell me what do you think is wrong with this particular image. This guy Escher is a very famous individual, and he's renowned for painting and drawing these creations which twist the mind. So have a quick look and tell me what do you think is wrong. I'm assuming that you're looking at. Excuse me, guys. Just give me a second, please. Thank you. Hi again, sorry for that. So, in fact, if you look at this water pouring down here, this waterfall, it makes sense, right? Quick look, everything seems to make sense. But if we were to look at the trajectory of the water, where the water is coming from, suddenly you realize that something is very wrong. Till here, everything is okay. Then we're coming down here where my cursor is, and then suddenly, whoa, okay, this is weird, because these columns shouldn't be under this part if they are here. Because this is further away than there. Then you keep on going and it gets even more weird, mind-boggling. Because technically speaking, it makes sense. But when you look at it directly, it does not make sense. So when you look at all the picture, it looks great. But when you look deeply into little parts and little aspects of it, suddenly it makes anything but sense. And it keeps on getting more weird and more weird and more weird and more weird. Are you with me, guys?
Yes.
Now, why did Escher do this? Because Escher wanted to prove one very interesting thing. The eyes tend to do away with as much detail as possible and try to grasp the overall idea of the full image that you're seeing in front of you. So the eye can actually omit mistakes. The eye can remove mistakes. The eye can remove things given that those things are made in a particular way which can cheat the eye. So we know how to cheat the eye into believing what we want it to believe. So if we're to look at the drawing like it's a full drawing, a whole drawing, it makes perfect sense. But then if we make the eye recognize the mistakes, then obviously the brain will start, wondering what the hell is going on. Because what the brain is seeing and what the eye is seeing is not exactly the same thing. Now, technically speaking, the brain sees what the eye sees, right? But obviously there is the aspect of the reality versus the, let's call it the unreality, okay? Because it's unreal in a way. Okay, so that is one of Escher's. There's many more drawings. If you want to look up Escher, there's many more optical illusions which are quite fun. Let's have a look at another depth cue, which is size. So this is something that we discussed when we looked, for example, we looked at this drawing of this drawing of God of War. All right, the further away an object is, obviously it's going to appear smaller. And this is the explanation. What's happening is that we have two objects over here. One of them is further away from this one. But when they actually enter our eye, so the distant object here is actually refracting into a smaller shape than the closer object, which is refracting into a larger shape. So the smaller this object, which is actually closer, sorry, I meant closer and further, not bigger or smaller. So the closer object distends a larger surface area on the eye, in the back of the eye, and the smaller object distends a smaller surface area on the back of the eye. So that gives the illusion of depth because it reduces the size. Why does the eye do that? Simply to be able to grasp as much, to see as much as it can, because obviously if the eye were to see all the objects as being the same size, then there would be, one, no idea of depth, and two, obviously the eye wouldn't be able to see everything. So like that, the eye would be able to fit in as many things as possible in its visual perspective. And this is what it amounts to. So this would be an actual photo, an actual image, photographic image. We see that the car is obviously receding in the distance. They're the same size, obviously. And we see this is 1 point perspective. Again, all the lines are leading into a vanishing point somewhere over here in the distance. And here we see a game where that illusion has been recreated to create the idea that some cars are actually winning, some cars are losing, because some cars are ahead of you and some cars are behind you. So obviously the smaller the car is, that means the further away it is from you. The bigger it is, that means the closer it is. So you have an immediate understanding of the situation, as we see. Over here, this is an interesting aspect. Technically speaking, you're not supposed to see the red lines, but the question was, which is the longer line? Now, because of this perspective occurring over here, thing is, it won't show if I do this. It won't really show. Let me just share my other screen. 1 second, please. So if I were to stop sharing, stop streaming, and I would stream this. Okay, are you seeing my screen? Yes, you're seeing my screen. So if I were to ask you, for example, which is the longest line? This one over here, but I gave it up already, obviously. Now you know the answer. Or this one over here. Now, at a glance, this line over here, okay, the line which is to the right, the dark line which is to the right, appears like it's at least double the size of this line. Technically speaking, they are exactly the same size. They're exactly the same size. The illusion is because of these lines over here, which seem as if they are receding into the distance, creating a 1 point perspective. And because of that, the eye believes automatically that there's distance, and so it believes that this eye is bigger than this line is bigger than this line. Because of the illusion of distance. And the fact there is no distance. These are just flat lines. They've been drawn as if to assimilate a reduction into the distance. Are you with me, guys? Does it make sense?
Yes.
And that is
Yes.
the end of this slide. 1 second. Okay. Any questions you might want to ask me? Any comments you might want to pass? No? Super.
Okay.
Yes? No?
No, I'm saying it's all good.
All right, brilliant. Okay, so our next topic is sequential art, otherwise known as comics. Has anyone ever read a comic in his or her life? Have you ever read comics?
Marvel. I like Marvel a lot.
Brilliant. Any favorite character or group of characters?
X-Men or Deadpool. I like Deadpool. I like a lot, as in is hilarious.
You wouldn't believe it that those are my favorite Marvel characters also. So we have something in common, Jamie. Brilliant. Jamie, have you read comics or just watched movies?
No, I read comics as well. I have a collection, actually.
Brilliant. Good to know. Good to know. I also have a very modest collection myself. I just bought the full compendium of what's he called now? Of Mamma Mia. I'm really bad at names. 1 second. Hellboy. Anyone heard of Hellboy? There were 2 movies also of Hellboy. Anyone? Excuse me.
Yeah, Hellboy is good. I watched the movie though, not comics. Hellboy is
Yes.
good.
There are a couple of really good movies. Quite funny. This is the first movie. This is the first installment, if I'm not mistaken. This is the movie by the director is Guillermo del Toro. He's amazing director, obviously. And then there's the comic, obviously. Sort of the movie has made quite a massive sound. So yeah, this is the second installment. This is the guy. Actually, the guy who did the Hellboy, the second movie, is the same guy who is in Stranger Things. He's the father of the girl. Anyone watch Stranger Things? Anyone?
Yes, he's the police. He's the
Yeah.
cop. Oh,
Yeah, he's the cop.
yeah,
Cop, exactly.
exactly.
He does the part perfectly, huh? He does the part perfectly. So this is the comic vis-a-vis the 2 characters. This is the first one, the first installment. First movie, this is the second movie. Both very good ones, definitely. I think I personally prefer the first movie. The second movie is funny, good story, funny, but I think character-wise, this guy was a bit better, a bit more him. So yeah, I just bought them because he's one of my favorite characters, and again, here we go. From the love this guy. There's some nice statues also on the market. He cuts off his horns because his horns actually make him a bad guy. So without the horns, he's a good guy. Prosthetics being applied, awesome. I love it. All right, so comics. Anyone else? Jamie, thank you. Anyone else? So Jamie likes Marvel.
Not comics per se, but does manga count?
Definitely. Those are the Japanese, the Eastern, Far East comics. Yes, they are comics, and basically manga is the Japanese word for comic. Exactly the same thing. It's as if you're saying comic in Japanese.
Oh, okay. Alright.
Okay, what is your favorite manga?
I think Uzumaki.
I've never watched that one. Roughly, what's the story about? Couple of lines.
It's sort of like a horror, but it's more on the psychological side. Basically, a city gets run over with spirals. Doesn't make any sense if you explain it, but it's a pretty brilliant story.
Well, it is a topic that the Japanese love to discover. To go into sort of the psychological horror. This kind of perspective is something very, very, very Japanese. In fact, one of my favorites is Death Note. I don't know if anyone has ever watched Death Note or read Death Note, because it's also they tried to do the movie, which was a
That's cool.
yeah, it's very, very, very.
I love it.
Brigitte?
I've watched, but haven't read it personally.
Okay, so we watched the movie.
No, I've watched the series.
You watched the series. All right. Okay. The okay, the anime. Brigitte?
Yes, the anime of Death Note. I watched it a few times. I really like it. My favorite.
It's a very interesting psychological study because of the fact that sort of imagine guys, imagine you find a book and you can write the name of someone and that guy just dies or that woman just dies, a natural death which obviously looks natural, but well, natural in the sense that, you know, run over by a car, if you can call that natural, or something falls on the person or something like that. You know, imagine the power that you hold. But then there's the ethical question of who are you to decide who should die or who should live. I think that is the whole thought behind this very particular anime. I think it's extremely interesting. They did try to do a live action film, Netflix, and I liked it in a way, but it wasn't as half as good as the actual anime or the manga. But it was an interesting prospect. No, anything else? All right, great. Anyone else? Definitely
I
mangas
started
is.
watching manhwa, reading manhwa. It's the Korean version of comics. So.
That is very interesting. That is something that I never expected in any class, let alone my part-timer class. Because usually the part-timers are the ones who, you know, are more serious. They're the one who are more about the job and the family and so. So no, that's super great that you guys actually have all this. How would you say? Experience when it comes to comics. Super. Look, that's very, very, very interesting. Can you tell me how come you managed to sort of you came by this interest?
Actually, I just had finished a manga. I think it was Bleach.
Yes.
I finished it and
That
just
one.
searched online what is the best thing to watch, how to read next, and Solo Leveling was one of them. And then I searched, and it was a manhwa instead of a manga.
That's very interesting. And can you tell me the difference? Because I never actually went into that kind of sequential art.
Actually, it's quite the same, apart from the names that are usually Korean based, and
Mhm.
I mix them up since they're similar. But I think even the drawing is a bit different, not
Okay.
like the Japanese art. It's a bit different.
Mhm. In fact,
I
the
don't
only
know
thing
how to
I
explain it
know,
exactly.
no, I totally understand you because the only thing I know is that manga is so popular in Japan that they, you know, Japanese can't have enough of it. And the weird thing is not just the Japanese, but the Koreans also are totally in love with manga. Sort of, it's a Japanese export into South Korea, and sort of then they started doing their own version of manga because again sort of the demand was so enormous, and that is one of the reasons actually that manga is drawn specifically in black and white, just drawing, just inking. There's absolutely no coloring, for the simple reason that the people can't get enough and they need to print as fast as possible to be able to assuage the thirst of the, oh, that's beautiful, assuage the thirst of, you know, these readers, these consumers of manga who are avidly interested in what's going to happen next. It is a cult in Japan. It is an art. It is a cult. It is a religion. Manga and anime are sort of nigh religious, you know, very close to being seen as religious.
In fact, the manhwas, I think it's mostly colored, so all the images are with color,
Okay.
not black.
Not black and white, such as the manga, the Japanese manga. Okay, all right, interesting. Because usually most manga is black and white. Again, because of that reason mainly.
If I
It's
may add, manhwa, they are usually one chapter, it's one long scroll. Because usually manga, they're just pages. I love it. But manhwa, besides being usually in color, it's also, you have almost the whole chapter usually in just one page. You have to scroll and it keeps on going, the story and
that is impressive. That is impressive. Thank you so much, Maria. To sort of, you see, sort of, I'm here trying to teach and I'm learning in return, which is bemusing, but also incredible. No, that is something I never knew, Maria, which is very interesting. And you see sort of culture taking over because although it was a Japanese export, but it seems that the Koreans actually made it their own because it must not have been a recent export at all. That export must have happened quite a long while ago. In fact, believe it or not, the first manga artist is this guy over here. Excuse me. And the guy is Hokusai. Hokusai, and it's called Hokusai manga. So let me just, this is the first instance of manga. You're going to recognize the painting immediately. He's a very old Japanese artist, and you must for sure have seen this painting somewhere, guys. 1 second, transferring, there you go. Have you ever seen that painting anywhere?
Yes, of course. That's very common.
That painting has been reproduced ad nauseum, literally all over the world. And if you tell me that you haven't seen this painting, then sort of you haven't been alive for the last I don't know how many years. Because this painting, this is Hokusai. This is one of the most famous paintings of Hokusai, and Hokusai is actually the guy who is said to be the father of manga. So I'm going to switch on the camera. Hi guys. And this is a collection of Hokusai manga. It's a tiny little box set. It's very interesting. And in fact, if you were to flip through the pages, all you'd see are different postures, different paintings. You know how much? There you go. So you see different postures of human beings. Okay, so this would be the Edo life. So there's life in Japan, basically Edo life. Then there's the wonders of nature. So it would be more beautiful images of Japan. Yeah. So now we have like humans swimming in water. Okay, and that's the third one. He was a very prolific artist. Very prolific artist. There we go. This is Flights of Fancy. Flights of Fancy. So we see actual bits and pieces of Japanese life. There's dragons and customs, traditions, right? And sort of in most of his paintings, he actually has words accompanying. So there's text accompanying the image. So that is a very important attribute of sequential art, which we know as comic. Right, so you have the text over here, the image over here. So there's like tons of this, and he's actually seen as the father of manga for the simple reason that he was the first guy who actually started drawing and not just including an image, but also including text within the image. So. Why are we going to? First of all, I'm rather impressed. by your answers when I asked you if you ever watched comics, and sort of I never expected such detail. Thank you. This is something which excites me in a way. So my next question is, why are we going to study comics? Sort of what's so important about comics? Comics are, the best thing when it comes to visual art. Comics have an image accompanying by text, accompanying by so many other nuances, and together they collate to create a story which is extremely visual yet aided with text to be able to give a complete rendering of the imagination. And in fact, there are several types of different types of comics which have been produced all over the world. There's the American style, there's the Hollywood style, there's the European style, there's the Spanish style, which is within Europe, obviously. Then there's the Japanese, Korean, African. So every culture basically came out with its own plethora of comics. So comics have existed for millennia, basically. In Europe, they have been much more recent. And my first question is, what do you think is the first comic? What do you think is the first instance of comics in the modern world? So basically, the question is, which were the first comics? But before we go to that question, so think a bit about it. I would like you to, first of all, understand the idea of why sequential art. It is art in sequence, sort of it follows a pattern, it follows sort of a reading style from left to right in the West, from right to left in Japan, and from front to back in the West, from back to front in Japan and the Far East. And now we move to the next slide where I have this couple of interesting comic strips where we have different expressions, facial expressions, saying the same word. So you're fired, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired. Sort of automatically the same words suddenly take on a completely different meaning just by assimilating them to an expression. And notice the simplicity of the expression, guys. You know, it's non-realistic. There are realistic elements, but it's non-realistic. It's not really a human being. It's just a potato with features, literally. So by just using very simplistic artistic techniques accompanied by text, you suddenly have expressed very, very poignant emotions. Here we have another series of text, basically saying I love you, and below the words down here. So technically speaking, just by applying the same text to different kinds of images, we suddenly are passing a totally different message. So the question I would like you to think about is, which do you think were the first comics? And obviously, go ahead. Tell me what you think.
Well, I think from the name comic, it's supposed to be funny. I think it was probably in newspapers or something.
Okay, so whereabouts would your guess be? Would you say early 1900s? Would you say further away from that?
Gosh, I'd say when newspapers became a thing or something, the comic section. I mean, usually when it comes to art or music or things, usually it's a religion that has the first, you know, related to the church, maybe the story of Christ, but I wouldn't call that like comical. So that's why I would say newspapers instead.
Okay. Fair enough. I think that's a very detailed answer, which I think is a bit close to the truth. It is a bit close to the truth. So yes. A very interesting answer. Okay, anyone else, please?
I would have said the same thing as Bridget, actually.
Okay, so we don't have any different opinions as to...
Yes, yeah. Don't have any idea.
No, no one will dare go against what Bridget said. Wow, someone seems scared of you, Bridget. You seem to be leading the class in this perspective. Okay, all right. Give me a
I don't know
second.
what I'm talking about, though. I'm just guessing.
No. You are close. You are close because the moment that you're mentioning in time is the moment that comics became prolific. That comics actually could be more reachable. They became cheaper, so that is one of the reasons that it made them more reachable. And we need also to understand a very important fact. An important fact was that in those days, people did not travel. People did not travel, absolutely not travel as we travel today. There wasn't any Ryanair, there wasn't any EasyJet, we couldn't take 25-euro flights. People didn't even have the chance to travel, let alone to travel so fast and so cheaply. They didn't even travel by boat or by ship because that was so expensive. And remember, the majority of human beings living 100 years ago, 120 years ago, were extremely poor. So obviously, they basically spent their entire lives literally living in the same area without seeing what's beyond their borders. So obviously, comics were extremely prolific because first of all you have the idea of printing, so obviously they're making them cheaper and more achievable, and then we have these people who are dying to be exposed to what is out there, to the imagination of others. So we have, you know, adventurers going out in the jungle or in the Amazon or in the deserts, you know, things that these children and these adults could not see in reality. So they were being given the utmost of imagination. right? And they could actually see things which they knew that they would never see otherwise. There was no TV, there was no radio, there was nothing basically. So the sort of the pictures were something that were just entering, but again, the pictures were expensive and the pictures were not really, something amazing because there wasn't really any fantasy. It was just moving images of reality. So it wasn't nothing out of the ordinary, and only the rich could afford it, not the poor, and so on and so forth. But to answer my question, which were the first comics, we need to go back in time. And one of the first proponents would be the Neolithic era and the time of the Egyptians. And the thing is sort of because they were the first drawings which were actually, sort of showing some type of action. Over here we see a hunt. These individuals are hunting like pigs, something that looks like pigs, and something that looks like a saber-toothed tiger over there. That could be the cubs of the saber-tooth, because there's a cub over here just seems to be lactating. And then there's more individuals over here who look like they're actually having a meal, they're actually eating. And then over here it seems like there's aliens flying across the sky, which is weird. But it's okay. And over here, there's like these individuals are actually hunting. They're hunting deer over here. So this is Altamira and Lascaux in France. Altamira is in Spain, Lascaux is in France. And down here we see sort of one of the myriad of paintings, tomb paintings in Egypt, accompanied by hieroglyphs. Now, one thing we need to understand. A very important aspect of comics is that for something to be qualified to qualify as a comic, it needs to have both an image and words. So that automatically removes Lascaux and Altamira as being the first proponent of comics, because there are no words. It's just images, all right, albeit the fact that they're showing action. They're showing a sequence in a way, not really, because it's just one panel, literally. Sort of they are divided. Could be that there are 3 panels in one, perhaps, or 2 panels in one. But ultimately, it's the same picture, no words. The second one, we have images and we have words, right? Because there is speech over here. This is the way that the Egyptians used to write. But the problem is that those are not words; those are pictograms. So again, these are not images accompanied by words, but these are pictograms which actually mean something, actually mean a sound, and then that sound would actually have a particular meaning. So technically speaking, we don't have an image accompanied by words, but we just have images accompanied by further images. So the question persists: which were the first comics? And the answer is the biotapestry. What is the biotapestry? Any idea what the biotapestry is? Anyone? Ever heard of the biotapestry? What does it sound like?
I have a feeling I know about it, but it's not coming.
Most probably that feeling is because when you were very, very, very young in school, you actually mentioned them in your history class. Most probably.
Drawing on papyrus, like the leaves, so but that's not tapestry.
No, change papyrus to actual tapestries, to actual carpets hanging from the ceiling, and this is what you get. Have you ever seen something like that?
I saw something similar, I think, in a museum somewhere. Also, I think there was something in Valletta, the old parliament. I'm not sure.
Yes, no. I'm not sure about the old parliament, but I'm definitely sure about St. John's Co-Cathedral, where there's a whole room full of these tapestries. Have you ever been? Have you ever visited?
I don't remember. It's been too long.
It's been too long. It's been too long. So
now that I see, they're usually continuously, right?
Okay,
I think I saw them in a museum abroad. I don't remember which one. I think it was in.
The creation of tapestries was literally came out of necessity. In those days, although they had very thick walls in buildings, in castles and religious buildings and so on and so forth. Yet they were not enough to cut out the cold. They were not enough to cut out the cold. So they came up with this idea of hanging carpets literally from the ceiling, massive carpets, so they would act as insulation against the cold of the outside. And obviously it was too boring having like just carpets hanging, monocolor carpets. So they came up with a fantastic idea of actually embroidering these with images. And when it came to castles, especially, what was the next best thing to embroider than sort of events, battles, which were part of the history of that castle, perhaps, or the soldiers who resided in that castle, or the king of that castle, and the battles that the king had won. So this is the biotapestry, and the biotapestry actually recounts of the invasion of Normandy, and how it develops. We have particular characters, so these characters would be real characters who existed in history, real monks, real monarchs, and if you notice, they are literally panels, one by one, next to each other, of actions going on. The horses being placed into the ships sailing off to the enemy. Then the battle is being fought down here between Saxon and Norman, and so on and so forth. And there's like a myriad of these tapestries in Normandy and France. But you notice that the images are all accompanied by text, and that is the best and the most important proponent of sequential art, comics, that the image is accompanied by text. So this is basically the first instance of comics ever to exist in the world. Obviously, as we said, then in the Far East, things were also building up in an interesting way. We see here a couple of works by Hokusai. We have the tsunami over here, the big wave with Mount Fuji in the distance. We have a couple of very typical Japanese, or Chinese rather, what do we call these guys? Come on, help me. These are pandas eating this sugar cane over here, beautifully drawn sugar cane. Again, we see text accompanying image. Again, we see text accompanying image. And then we move on to what made it possible. The fact that the printing press came into existence made the creation of these comics even cheaper, more available, and normal people, the everyday Tom, Dick, and Harry could actually put their hands, actually acquire a copy of these comics. So the printing press gets rise to the newspaper, and the newspaper gave rise to the possibility of a magazine. So that is where you're right, Brigitte. The actual first modern comic, was in the time when the newspaper was created, because the first comics were actually replicated in the first newspapers. So applause to Brigitte, because yes, you were right in that sense. Yeah?
Thanks.
My pleasure. Very welcome. So these are the first comics that appeared in these newspapers. Again, we have image accompanied by text. We have the first advent of the word comic being used, comic drawings, wonderful exploit in search of a sweetheart, a series of comic drawings. And here are the comic drawings. We have an image accompanied by text, So the image is giving more to the text, and the text is giving more to the image. So they literally balance each other. So technically speaking, this text would be offset by that image, and that image would give much more detail, and so on and so forth. So here, the 18th century, so basically in the end of the 18th century, we have this, so we're talking about the 1780s, 1790s, we have the first advent of what we call comics. So basically 200 years ago rather than 100 years ago, as soon as we had the first printing press. So they brought forth newspapers with illustrations, and one of the first individuals was Rudolf Topfer. I don't know how to pronounce that. I think that's how it's pronounced. Is seen as the oldest recognized American cartoonist. But remember, in those days, a lot of Americans were actually first generation Americans. So they were still with German surnames, Italian surnames, and so on and so forth. And this is the first color comic that was produced. It's extremely politically incorrect. We have Around the World with the Yellow Kid, and the Yellow Kid is seen here being depicted as a Chinese individual, and even he's very much drawn in in a very politically incorrect way. Even the black people are drawn in a very politically incorrect way. Sort of they're drawn very much like, how would you call them, like those dolls that Enid Blyton used to employ in her writing. The what did they call them? The black dolls. In fact, a lot of books by Enid Blyton were actually made illegal because of this particular doll. I forgot the name of the doll. There's a particular name though. So you can recognize that the fact that this drawing is definitely not woke. There's a lot of political incorrectness, especially in depicting different races, different ethnicities. But obviously, we can see a huge improvement in printing and the introduction of color printing, because obviously now we have the RGB system, red, green, blue. This led to the Hearst papers featuring Richard Ucall's cartoon in color, notably the bold, big-eared central figure whose bedclothes were colored yellow. The Yellow Kid became the first significant recurring comic strip character. So he became he is the anticipation of what was going to happen in the future, whereby the people started to associate themselves, the readers started to associate themselves with a unique character. That unique character became the hero, and they wanted this hero to reappear in further works so that they would follow the life of this hero, the interminable life of this hero, because this hero seems like it never died. He never died. In fact, if we sometimes look at some of the comic heroes of today, we'll see that a lot of the comic heroes have existed for 80 years, 100 years, and some of them seem like they will never die. We do have some recent changes. For example, in DC Comics, we see Batman growing old, we see Superman dying, for example. We see from like an X-Men. We also see some of the members of X-Men, like for example, who's the guy with the Jamie, the guy with the claws, what's his name? Wolverine. Exactly. Gets old in one of the comics, and so we see this idea of age. But again, it still doesn't make sense, because it is just a one-off. It is not like the comic character has a beginning and an end. It is a character which we need the person who owns the character needs to make money out of it. So obviously it can't just be killed off, because that would be a downright shame. This led to an explosion of merchandising. So this is the first instance of merchandising. So merchandising basically started in the late 1800s, and it was rejuvenated basically by the time that Star Wars came back in the scene in 1970s, late 1970s, where the director of Star Wars, George Lucas, actually came up with the notion of merchandising again, and they started doing all these toys and all these comics and so on and so forth, which had to do with Star Wars, and actually that earned him much more money than the movies themselves. So this, in a way, was seen as the first graphic novel, and graphic novel is one of the terms associated with comics. It is a graphic novel because it would be a collection of comics together, gathered as a whole novel with a beginning and an end. So it would be a stand-alone story. Okay, guys, let's have a bit of a break, shall we? Let's have 5 minutes. You can go on and get a coffee, and then we'll meet here, let's say, at 7:30. Would that be okay?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Brilliant. See you in a few minutes, guys. Thank you. Hi guys, welcome back.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hope you managed to make yourselves a coffee. And had a bit of a break from my voice. Been rambling on for the past hour and a half, roughly. Okay, so is everyone back here? Alex, you with us? Brilliant, thank you, Alex. Brigitte, I think I heard your voice.
Yes, I'm here.
Super, thank you, Brigitte. Gavin? Gavin? We'll give some more time. Gavin?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Jamie?
I'm here. I'm here.
Thank you. Maria, I think I heard your voice also. And Luke?
I'm here, sir.
Brilliant. Thank you, guys. So, back to business. Our next slide is going to be Crazy Cat. Crazy Cat is technically the cartoon, the comic which takes away the laurel reliefs from Walter Disney for coming up with the first mouse which can talk, because Crazy Cat actually in the 1920s came up with this concept of a cat and a mouse which can talk, and it created this idea of surrealism. Surrealism is a type of art, and sort of the main artist which is attributed to this movement is Salvador Dali, who died not very long ago, if I'm not mistaken, in the 70s. He was a bit of a quirky character, really, very, very weird moustache. And he came up with this idea of the concept of time, sort of where there's those melted clocks and so on and so forth. So the idea of having animals which are talking and actually reacting as if they are human beings obviously was something that was unheard of at the time. Remember, 1920s, people were just thinking about, getting the next couple of dollars to be able to exist, to live in a time when the world was not exactly in a good place. It's between the two wars, the First World War and the Second World War. There was a financial disaster. The Wall Street calamity, and this helped to assuage the feelings, the depression of the time. In fact, it's called the 1930s, the 1920s, 30s depression, the interwar period, and sort of these sort of helped people believe a bit more, one might say, in having a bit of hope, because it transported them into a world which was entirely different from the realism around them. And it also gave artists the possibility to be cynical in their work, to create politically affluent depictions of reality in a way which could not really give them any, how would you say, any backlash, right? Because obviously they were using animals to criticize politicians of the time and the era. Another very famous comic is Mouse. I don't know if you ever heard of the comic. We'll be having a look at some different comics later on in this PowerPoint. So let me just give you an idea of what I'm talking about. This is Mouse. Let's have a look at some images. This is the front cover of Mouse. Mouse is basically a mouse in German, and it is a story about mice and pigs and dogs. And technically speaking, the mice are the Jews, the pigs are the Germans, and the dogs are the Americans and the British. And again, it's very much like George Orwell's Animal Farm in a way, but George Orwell's Animal Farm is about communism, while this is directly about the Second World War and the Jewish Holocaust. It's a very interesting story. It's one of the novels that literally changed the way comics were looked at, because at first comics were seen simply as a way out of reality, but then they became very much associated with political satire, and also sort of depicting reality in a bit of a softer undertone, So that is Mouse. So Crazy Cat, the surrealistic notes of Crazy Cat gave advent to the later days of Walt Disney with Mickey Mouse and all the gang, and so on and so forth. So this was quite the development, and in fact we see that there's the first idea of the comic strip. We can see that there's actual scenes, different scenes, one following the other, giving a whole story. And there's the depiction of movement also, the drawing of the brick here with the motion lines, thought bubbles, speech bubbles, and so on and so forth. There's quite a lot of advancements in a few years, literally. And then obviously things started improving more. So we have here some of the very early colored comics: Will Gould's Red Berry, Percy Crosby's Skippy, 1920s again. This is also 1920s. Notice the style of clothes. Notice the realistic versus the unrealistic. Here we have a bit of a more comic-y application over here, something that we are quite used to today. This is the advent of the British comic with the Beano and the Dandy. One might say the same color codes of the Beano and the Dandy, which again provided a lot of satire in a day and age where satire was very much needed, especially to criticize politicians. So the comic book the comics became so famous that they started being collected in books. And we have the first collection known as the Famous Funnies, 100 comics and games, puzzles, magic. So this was the escape zone of young people, of teens, of young boys and girls in a time where life was very difficult. In the 1930s, Second World War was very much around the corner. First World War was very much something that was very much remembered. Today we see that we are just having a very tiny taste of that with what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. We are all horrified at this experience, especially in this day and age. But I can imagine the horror that these individuals were living in, especially in a couple of wars which encompassed the whole globe, basically. So the Famous Funnies, the comic that most historians will tell you is the first modern comic book, conceived by William Wildenberg. The publication boasted 100 different strips and features beginning in 1934. Wildenberg was a salesman for Eastern Color Printing, so obviously he could facilitate the production of his comic by actually creating a colored version, which was something extremely innovative for that day and age. It also, if you notice, came at the exorbitant fee of 10 cents, which might seem as a pittance today, but was not a pittance at the day, although 10 cents could be, for example, in a day where a grown-up, a man, a family guy could actually earn about $1 or $2 a day. 10 cents would be a tenth of his wage, so that would be roughly translated to, let's say, 10 euros today. So basically, a comic in the day would cost about 10 euros today, which retains roughly the same price. Today they're a bit cheaper, like 5 euros, 10 euros, depends what you buy. But for 100 comics, I think this was quite a cheat. I think it was quite reasonable as a price. But then again, remember that this is something that could be lent, so obviously it would be dog-eared by the time it would have been read by the whole streets, from one boy going to another boy, and so on and so forth. So this is, a huge thing happening, something which really changed the way the visual arts were being transposed in a time where visual arts were not accessible to all, like photography, film, and so on and so forth. The famous excuse me?
I think at the same time frame, like a bottle of Coca-Cola was like 5 cents for like comparison.
And a bottle of Coca-Cola was not something that you would buy every day.
Exactly, that's the thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very true. I think that's a very good comparison, because a bottle of Coca-Cola was something that was seen by most families as something that you would buy on a Sunday, for example, you know, something which was a definite treat. So, yes, that gives it much more of a perspective, I might say. Thank you. Famous funnies became so famous that this was the first time that comics were actually translated into a live action series known as Buck Rogers in the 25th century, a series which ran from 1979 till 1981, which was, one might say, the heyday for fantasy films. In fact, if you look at that poster of Buck Rogers, what other movie of the period does it remind you of? Forget the old guy. Look at these three characters over here. What would it remind you of in a bit of a crazy way? Think back. You know, films, movies which are still quite famous today, actually.
Star Trek?
Star Trek, brilliant, and?
Star Wars?
And Star Wars.
That's Star Wars.
Yes, I can see Han Solo in this guy.
Han Solo, eżatt, ħanajda.
You can see a bit of a Princess Leia in this female, and you can definitely
R2D2,
C-3PO, exactly. So we're seeing, you know, sort of, you know, movies affecting each other, sort of, and the amazing thing that it all started off from these famous funnies, these comics, which literally translated into some of the great works, which let's say were the beginning of what we have today. And another interesting element that we need to talk about is the fact that the voice of Mel Blanc was used in Buck Rogers. And Mel Blanc, I don't know how much aware you are, Mel Blanc was one of the main creators of comedies and comic fiction in the era. Mel Blanc was, you know, a big name at the time, very big name at the time. So the fact that there was Mel Blanc in this production made it quite a big production. So things continued growing, and the pulps came into existence. Now, what are the pulps? The pulps were a type of comic which actually had a hero, and this was the first advent of the hero, apart from the Yellow Kid, quite a few years before. So we have the hero, and the hero has a storyline, an arc, and in this arc we see him having his adventures, saving the pretty damsels in distress, killing the bad guys which come from all over the world, and the Phantoms going all over the place, to Africa and to Asia and all other exotic countries which these children in the US and mainland US could not actually go to and see in reality. So here is the advent of the superhero, the masked superhero wearing the skin tight suit, if you notice. So that we have the quite, you know, athletic body for the first time. We have the masked countenance of the superhero. So we start to get an idea of what's going to come, and what's going to come is definitely going to be something that you recognize. So over here we see you know, a page from the Phantom. Notice the colorification is quite drab. It's quite let's say not exactly what we are used to today, but for the time period that was something which was amazingly done. Okay. And this brings us to another development, which is Marvel. This is the first instance. Marvel came before DC, and Marvel was literally a collection of comics. There were no heroes as we know of them today, but we start having this advent. So the Marvel tales, the Marvel stories were a collection of comics, and this collection of comics started creating the idea of these heroes which were to save the day, heroes which were relatable, heroes which basically meant that young kids in the day could actually relate and could actually hope for a better future. So moving on to the 4-color pulps, 4 colors being CMYK, because those were the colors of printing at the time and even today. And here we see the first detective comics, which basically became the first DC. That is why they are called DC, because they originated as detective comics. So Anyone who loves DC over here, these are the origins. And here we have the first Batman, who technically speaking was just a detective who used to run around at night and did not have the potential that we see in him today. In fact, some of the first Batmans were quite comedic Batmans, not the Batman, the gruff, the dark, the very serious Batman that we see today. I think the latest Batman is actually being launched in Malta this weekend, if I'm not mistaken, or has been launched last weekend. It's the Batman with the guy from, what's the name of that pathetic movie? Any idea, guys?
Twilight.
Excuse me?
Twilight, I think.
Twilight, brilliant. Yeah, that's the guy. Mela, 1 second. So, excuse me. Twilight Saga. Let me see, the actor is Robert Pattinson, yes. I remember the first time I saw Robert Pattinson in the Twilight series, I was like, WTF, because I'm not really a fan of the series. It was a bit too, how can I call it without being sexist? It was a bit too airy for me. And it was quite a surprise to have Robert Pattinson chosen as Batman, but they did say I did have some interesting feedback that he is making quite an interesting Batman. This is the poster of Twilight over here. That's the poster of Twilight and New Moon and so blah 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 blah. Twilight Saga. Well, okay. Yeah, and so we had Detective Comics, and Detective Comics, as I said, were the DC Comics, and then we had the Action Comics, which were a derivative of. So if you own one of these comics, for example, this is the first installment of Superman over here. Again, a DC equivalent. This is how it all started. Basically, excuse me. So basically, if you are to own, I don't know, if you were to look, like in your attics or whatever, and find one of these copies, this is the first Superman ever, #1. I think this sold at around 1.2 million euros. Sorry, 1.2 million dollars, which makes it around a million something euros. In pristine condition, obviously. Because obviously it is literally part of the history of the world, and it is something which, gave rise to a whole new concept of comics, a whole new concept of the superhero, a new concept of how visual arts were to develop. Obviously, Superman was created in a time of warfare, in a time where the world was at war. So Superman was the guy who was created to come and save the world from evil, and evil in those days was in the shape of the Nazis, as you can see very well over here in this image. Marvel Comics, first instance of the Human Torch, not as we know him today as part of the X-Men. The Human Torch came as a standalone in the past, and then obviously it evolved into the X-Men that we know today. This is 1960s with Goodman. Bringing about, Goodman was the predecessor, one might say, of Stan Lee. He was the guy who launched Marvel Comics as we know them today, and Stan Lee was the guy who continued working on them and creating so many different characters. One of them, namely, being Spider-Man, one of the best creations of Stan Lee, one might say. And it's very interesting, the story of how Superman came into existence. Stan Lee was told that they need a comic where young people could actually start relating again, because a lot of the superheroes were becoming a bit too old in a way. Batman was in his 40s, Superman was in his 40s, all the superheroes were middle-aged. So Stan Lee was actually sketching something on a napkin in a diner. And he came up with this idea of a young man, in his teens, who has family issues, and then he gets sort of this superpower, and this superpower could actually help him overcome these family issues. And actually also help him save the day. Then there was also this idea of the bad guy, the funny bad guy in the guy who was in charge of the newspaper. Sort of, again, this is in a subtle way going against the media of the day, which was obviously one of the spokespersons of political parties. So obviously we see a lot of undercurrents going on in comics. It's not just as blatant as we think it to be. It's not just children's fairy tales, being depicted in colors. It's much more. It's much deeper than that. It is a way of how we can demonstrate our ailments, our psychological ailments, our problems, in a more how would you say, in a fun way, a way which can be easily understood by so many at the same time. This is here a video of Jack Kirby. It's an interesting video. We don't really need to watch the video, but it is Jack Kirby talking about something that I think would find surprising in this day and age. Because Jack Kirby over here says that at one point in time in the 1960s and 70s, he was actually communicating with two other people, because Jack Kirby was the penciler of the Fantastic Four, while Joe, I forgot his surname, Joe Sinnott, was the inker. Jack Kirby was the penciler, and then Rob Steibel was the guy who did the coloring. So basically, they were working together in 3 different states. They used to send the comic to each other. They would start with the penciler, then the inker, then the colorist. And it was amazing the amount of work that they did in day and age, where the only means of communication was the telephone. And the incredible thing that they did not ever communicate verbally together. They never actually met until much later, but they managed to produce so many comics over such a distance. In a time and age where internet did not exist and photocopiers did not exist, they had everything against them, but they still managed to make, wonders. At one point in time, the dreaded comic code arrived. This is something that we will talk about a bit more in our next session, guys. What I can say is the comic code was something that had to happen at some point in time. Technically, although it was called the comic code, it was the politicians' attempt to destroy a means of communication that was having a lot of effect on the young people. Young people were being affected by comics, and they were being affected in a positive way, because a lot of messages could be passed to young people in a very fun way, right? The thing is, the politicians started using the fact that some of the comics were a bit violent, perhaps, had a bit of a horror aspect, perhaps, or a bit of nudity in them. So they used that to try to fight comics and to try to destroy comics, because they knew that comics were a very important means of passing messages to our younger generations from those individuals, those older individuals who had seen the world and how the world was, sort of coming to what it was coming to, sort of all these wars and battles and political situations which were definitely not enviable. So the politicians tried to destroy the comic, but more of that in our next lecture. Okay, we can stop over here at this point today.
Thank you, sir.
You're very welcome. Any questions or queries or comments you'd like to pass before we close? So we will meet each other in 2 weeks' time, if I'm not mistaken. Am I right?
Yes, in 2 weeks' time.
Yes. Next week we'll have Jonathan. Week after you have me. Guys, thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for being here. I wish you all a pleasant evening and a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Wait, no. We have a lesson with you next week.
Next
Because
Wednesday.
we have with Jonathan. Yes, because we have a lesson with Jonathan in 2 weeks' time.
Brilliant, brilliant. In fact, that is music to my ears because that gives me 2 more sessions, which should be definitely enough to be able to finish everything that we need to finish. So I'll see you next week, even better, on a Wednesday at 6.
Great,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
All right.
Ciao.
Thank
Bon
you.
appetit. And have a nice evening.
Thanks. Bye.
You're welcome. Thank you.